Blockbuster did not collapse because people stopped watching movies. It collapsed because its strategy assumed physical retail would remain dominant. For years, late fees generated predictable revenue. Store networks created convenience. Brand recognition created scale. When digital distribution emerged, leadership hesitated. Mail-based subscription competitors gained traction. Streaming technology matured. Debt obligations limited experimentation. Store leases reduced flexibility. Capital defended existing infrastructure. In 2010, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. The failure was not technological ignorance. It was strategic inertia, reinforced by structural commitments. Blockbuster was founded in 1985 as a specialized video rental retailer. The company focused on standardized store formats and large film inventories. At a time when independent rental shops dominated the market, Blockbuster pursued scale. Centralized purchasing created negotiating power with film studios. Standardized store layouts simplified operations across locations. Brightly lit aisles organized movies by genre and popularity. Inventory systems allowed stores to manage thousands of titles efficiently. Customers could browse physical shelves and immediately rent new releases. Convenience became a defining competitive advantage. The brand expanded quickly across suburban retail corridors. Franchise and corporate locations followed a consistent operating model. The company invested heavily in physical retail infrastructure. Each store required long-term leases in high-traffic commercial areas. Retail presence reinforced brand familiarity with customers. Blockbuster stores became visible landmarks in shopping plazas. Weekend rental trips became routine consumer behavior. Households relied on physical stores for home entertainment access. The business model linked revenue directly to in-store transactions. Physical inventory determined what customers could watch. Popular titles were stocked in large quantities. New release walls became the central attraction in stores. Marketing campaigns reinforced Blockbuster as the dominant rental brand. Scale allowed the company to advertise nationally. Brand recognition accelerated further store expansion. The company opened hundreds of new locations annually during peak growth. Operational systems supported a rapidly growing retail network. Distribution logistics ensured regular supply of physical tapes and discs. Centralized purchasing lowered per-unit acquisition costs. Store managers focused on maintaining consistent retail experiences. Corporate leadership measured performance through store-level metrics. Foot traffic and rental frequency drove financial projections. Retail density increased convenience for customers. Multiple stores often operated within the same metropolitan region. Proximity reduced travel time for consumers seeking rentals. The network effect strengthened Blockbuster's local dominance. Competitors struggled to match the scale of the store footprint. Independent shops faced higher inventory costs. Smaller operators lacked comparable marketing budgets. Large physical networks created high entry barriers for new competitors. For over a decade, the company expanded its retail footprint aggressively. Retail dominance reinforced confidence in the store-based model. Leadership viewed scale as a durable strategic advantage. The company believed physical retail would remain the core distribution channel. Capital continued flowing toward new store openings. Operational success reinforced commitment to the retail strategy. Physical infrastructure defined the company's identity. Structural takeaway. Retail scale created early dominance but embedded long-term dependence on physical distribution. Late fees became a central component of Blockbuster's revenue model. The company structured rental agreements around fixed return deadlines. Customers typically rented movies for 1 or 2 nights. If the film was returned late, additional charges were applied. These penalties generated significant incremental revenue. Late fees required minimal additional operating cost. The system relied on predictable consumer behavior patterns. Many customers returned films later than scheduled. Each delay produced an additional transaction in the system. The fee structure was embedded in the point-of-sale software. Store employees processed late returns daily. Receipts displayed accumulated penalty charges. Customers often paid these fees during subsequent store visits. This created recurring revenue tied to rental frequency. Financial reporting increasingly recognized late fees as reliable income. Executives observed that penalties boosted overall margins. Late fees improved store-level profitability metrics. The policy reinforced disciplined return schedules for inventory circulation. Films could be rented again once returned to shelves. Higher turnover increased total rental volume. Operational models assumed late fee income would continue indefinitely. Corporate forecasts incorporated these revenues into long-term projections. Analysts evaluated store performance using combined rental and fee revenue. Customers occasionally complained about penalty charges. However, the policy remained consistent across the network. Standardization simplified accounting procedures. Late fees also discouraged extended possession of popular titles. This allowed new releases to return quickly to circulation. The model functioned effectively during peak store traffic years. As the network expanded, the number of rental transactions increased. More transactions created more opportunities for penalties. Late fee revenue grew alongside store expansion. The system required customers to physically return movies to the store. Return counters became regular points of interaction. Retail employees monitored overdue rentals through internal tracking systems. Reminder notices were occasionally issued for unreturned films. Stores maintained records of customer rental histories. The data supported enforcement of overdue penalties. Late fees became an accepted element of the Blockbuster experience. Consumers often tolerated the charges as part of the service. However, the policy created underlying customer frustration. Competitors later observed this dissatisfaction closely. Alternative models began to question the necessity of penalties. Subscription concepts started emerging in the rental market. These alternatives proposed unlimited viewing without late fees. The contrast highlighted a vulnerability in Blockbuster's pricing structure. The company remained financially reliant on the existing system. Operational habits reinforced dependence on the penalty revenue stream. Late fees continued to appear as a stable component of cash flow. Structural takeaway. Revenue structures built on penalties can create short-term profit while increasing long-term competitive vulnerability. As revenue grew, Blockbuster accelerated store network expansion. The company pursued geographic saturation in major metropolitan areas. Retail presence became a strategic priority for leadership. Each new store increased brand visibility within local markets. Standardized store design simplified rapid construction and rollout. Corporate teams identified high-traffic retail corridors for placement. Locations were often secured in suburban shopping centers. Long-term commercial leases locked in retail space for many years. These agreements guaranteed physical presence in key neighborhoods. However, they also created fixed operating obligations. Each store required inventory purchases and staffing. Operational costs scaled alongside the network footprint. Blockbuster believed density improved customer convenience. More locations reduced travel time for renters. Customers could easily access nearby stores for weekend rentals. This accessibility reinforced habitual store visits. The expansion strategy prioritized physical proximity to households. Retail saturation also limited opportunities for smaller competitors. Independent stores struggled to compete with Blockbuster's scale. The network grew into thousands of locations across multiple countries. By the early 2000s, Blockbuster operated over 9,000 stores globally. The retail footprint became one of the largest entertainment distribution systems. Each store functioned as a local distribution node. Films moved from studio suppliers to regional warehouses. From there, inventory was delivered to individual stores. Store managers managed shelf availability and title rotation. Centralized logistics coordinated distribution schedules. Retail performance was measured through store-level financial reports. Executives evaluated success through physical network growth. Capital investment prioritized new store openings. The infrastructure supporting retail became increasingly extensive. Physical assets defined the company's balance sheet. Leased properties became a permanent financial obligation. Closing stores early would trigger contractual penalties. This limited operational flexibility as market conditions evolved. Retail infrastructure was difficult to unwind quickly. The organization became structurally committed to physical distribution. Leadership confidence in store traffic remained strong. The store network appeared to protect market share. Customers still visited stores regularly for new releases. However, technology outside the retail model was beginning to evolve. Digital delivery experiments were emerging in the broader media industry. These signals initially appeared distant from the retail model. Blockbuster continued prioritizing store network stability. Operational focus remained centered on physical locations. Strategic thinking remained anchored to retail expansion. Structural takeaway: large physical networks can strengthen dominance while simultaneously locking organizations into inflexible operating structures. During the late 1990s, alternative distribution models began to appear. One of the most notable entrants was a mail-based rental subscription service. This model removed the need for physical store visits. Customers could request films online and receive them by postal delivery. DVD technology enabled this model because discs were lightweight and durable. The service operated through centralized distribution warehouses. Subscribers paid a monthly fee rather than individual rental charges. This subscription structure eliminated late fees entirely. Customers could keep discs for extended periods without penalties. Once returned by mail, the next title in a queue would ship automatically. The system relied on logistical efficiency rather than retail proximity. Inventory was stored centrally rather than across thousands of stores. Distribution centers processed large volumes of mail shipments daily. Online interfaces allowed customers to manage their rental queues. This approach gradually improved consumer convenience. Customers could browse film catalogs digitally. Title availability was not limited to a single store's inventory. Recommendations could be generated through data systems. This began shifting entertainment selection from physical browsing to digital interfaces. The subscription model created predictable monthly revenue streams. Operational costs were concentrated in logistics rather than retail leases. The absence of late fees became a marketing advantage. Consumers frustrated by penalties began exploring alternatives. Mail delivery introduced a different rhythm to movie consumption. Films arrived directly at home without travel requirements. The experience contrasted sharply with traditional store visits. Initially, the model appeared niche compared to Blockbuster's scale. Blockbuster leadership evaluated the concept cautiously. The existing store network remained profitable. Retail performance metrics still appeared strong. As a result, the emerging model was not immediately perceived as disruptive. However, subscription growth steadily increased. Customer adoption accelerated as internet usage expanded. Online ordering became increasingly common among households. Digital catalog browsing replaced physical shelf exploration. Logistics networks improved delivery reliability. Customer satisfaction surveys highlighted the absence of penalties. The contrast between subscription convenience and retail visits became clearer. Competitors refined algorithms for recommending films. Data-driven personalization improved user engagement. Meanwhile, Blockbuster's core operations remained focused on stores. Strategic attention remained centered on optimizing retail operations. The company underestimated the long-term implications of the subscription model. Operational confidence in the store network persisted. The competitive landscape was beginning to evolve quietly. Structural takeaway. Early alternative models often appear incremental until convenience advantages compound into systemic competitive shifts. As internet infrastructure improved, digital distribution became technically feasible. Broadband connections gradually expanded across households. Higher data speeds allowed larger media files to be transmitted online. Technology companies began experimenting with digital video delivery. Early streaming services tested compressed video playback through web platforms. Initial video quality was limited but steadily improved. Technology firms recognized the potential of direct digital distribution. Streaming removed the need for physical inventory entirely. Content could be accessed instantly without delivery or store visits. This represented a fundamental shift in media distribution. The model relied on internet bandwidth rather than retail infrastructure. Consumers increasingly spent time on internet-connected devices. Computers became central hubs for entertainment consumption. Software platforms began integrating video playback capabilities. Technology firms invested heavily in streaming infrastructure. Content licensing agreements gradually expanded into digital rights. Early streaming libraries were small but growing. Technology improvements accelerated the adoption curve. Video compression algorithms became more efficient. Buffering times decreased as network speeds improved. Online video platforms attracted increasing user attention. Streaming eliminated waiting periods associated with mail delivery. Consumers could begin watching content almost immediately. Convenience advantages began shifting consumer expectations. The concept of physical rentals started appearing less efficient. Technology investors recognized the potential scale of streaming services. Digital platforms required large server infrastructure rather than retail stores. Capital investments moved toward data centers and bandwidth capacity. Software engineers focused on optimizing video delivery protocols. Recommendation systems improved content discovery. User interfaces simplified browsing and playback selection. Subscription pricing models became common for streaming platforms. Monthly fees allowed unlimited viewing within digital catalogs. Consumers responded positively to on-demand accessibility. Traditional retail operators observed these developments cautiously. Streaming initially appeared technologically immature. Video resolution and internet coverage were still developing. Retail executives believed store visits would remain relevant. Existing revenue models continued to prioritize physical rentals. Strategic planning remained centered on the store network. However, the digital ecosystem continued advancing rapidly. Technology firms expanded streaming capabilities each year. Consumer familiarity with online services increased steadily. Content producers explored direct digital licensing arrangements. Digital distribution began reshaping media consumption habits. Retail infrastructure could not replicate the immediacy of streaming. Blockbuster recognized the technological trend but hesitated on implementation. Leadership continued balancing investment between physical stores and digital experiments. The structural shift toward digital delivery accelerated quietly. Structural takeaway. Technological signals often appear gradual until infrastructure maturity transforms them into dominant distribution systems. By the late 2000s, Blockbuster's financial structure had become increasingly rigid. Debt obligations accumulated from earlier corporate transactions. A leveraged capital structure required consistent cash flow to service interest payments. Operational decisions increasingly prioritized short-term revenue stability. Financial flexibility narrowed as liabilities remained fixed. Large portions of operating income were allocated to debt servicing. Capital available for experimentation became limited. Management attention focused on maintaining predictable store revenue. At the same time, the retail network carried extensive lease commitments. Thousands of store locations operated under long-term commercial contracts. These leases obligated the company to maintain store operations for many years. Closing stores prematurely would trigger significant financial penalties. As a result, the company remained structurally tied to physical locations. Retail infrastructure could not easily be reduced or reconfigured. Operating expenses remained high across the store network. Rent, utilities, and staffing created persistent cost obligations. Even modest declines in store traffic affected profitability. Revenue fluctuations quickly translated into financial pressure. Executives faced competing priorities between innovation and stability. Investments in new technology required capital that was already constrained. Digital experimentation risked undermining the store-based revenue model. Internal incentives favored protecting existing cash flow streams. Store performance metrics continued to dominate strategic discussions. Managers were evaluated based on retail profitability. Short-term operational targets reinforced the status quo. Meanwhile, competitors operated with different financial structures. Subscription-based services required fewer physical assets. Centralized logistics allowed more flexible cost management. Streaming platforms relied primarily on software infrastructure. Their cost structures scaled differently than retail networks. Blockbuster's legacy commitments slowed strategic adaptation. Each decision had to account for existing liabilities. Debt agreements limited financial maneuverability. Corporate leadership needed predictable revenue to meet obligations. This created caution around disruptive operational changes. Even when digital opportunities were recognized, execution was delayed. Management prioritized maintaining store performance metrics. Retail operations remained the primary focus of capital allocation. However, market conditions were shifting toward digital distribution. Consumer behavior gradually favored convenience and on-demand access. Blockbuster's financial structure reduced its ability to respond quickly. Strategic adjustments required resources that were already committed. Debt and leases together created structural inertia. Operational decisions became increasingly defensive. Financial commitments shaped the pace of transformation. Structural takeaway. When capital structures and fixed obligations dominate operations, strategic flexibility becomes constrained. Leadership in Blockbuster recognized the emerging digital shift. Internal discussions evaluated subscription and online distribution models. Several pilot programs explored alternative rental formats. However, these initiatives remained secondary to the core retail business. Store revenue still represented the majority of company income. Executives were cautious about disrupting profitable store operations. Strategic decisions balanced innovation against immediate revenue protection. The late fee model continued generating predictable cash flow. Retail stores remained the primary customer touchpoint. Corporate planning cycles prioritized quarterly retail performance. Digital initiatives progressed slowly within the organization. Technology teams experimented with online rental platforms. Some stores introduced limited digital service tests. However, the scale of these efforts remained small. Competitors continued expanding subscription-based offerings. Customer expectations gradually shifted toward convenience and flexibility. Streaming technology advanced year by year. Internet infrastructure supported faster and more reliable video delivery. Digital competitors refined user interfaces and recommendation systems. Blockbuster's response required coordination across retail and technology divisions. Internal processes slowed decision-making speed. Legacy operations required careful operational adjustments. Retail franchise operators also influenced corporate strategy. Many franchise owners depended on in-store rental revenue. Digital initiatives threatened to reduce store traffic. This created internal tension around transformation decisions. Corporate leadership sought gradual adaptation rather than rapid change. However, competitors moved quickly to scale digital platforms. Consumer adoption accelerated once streaming reliability improved. Subscription pricing models proved attractive to households. Digital services simplified entertainment access. Meanwhile, Blockbuster stores experienced gradual traffic decline. Retail performance metrics began weakening across locations. Store networks still carried significant operating costs. Digital investments were not large enough to offset declining retail income. Executives faced increasing pressure to stabilize the business. Strategic adjustments arrived later than industry shifts. The organization remained structurally aligned with its legacy model. Competitors gained momentum in the digital ecosystem. Streaming platforms accumulated subscriber bases rapidly. Blockbuster's brand remained recognized but operationally constrained. Leadership attempted to expand digital services more aggressively. However, the timing placed the company behind competitors. The transformation required resources and speed the company lacked. Market momentum had already shifted toward digital platforms. Structural takeaway: strategic awareness does not guarantee strategic execution when organizational structures resist rapid change. By the late 2000s, revenue patterns within Blockbuster began shifting noticeably. Store traffic gradually declined across many locations. Consumers increasingly explored subscription and digital alternatives. Weekend rental trips became less frequent in several markets. Retail transaction volumes began trending downward. Even small declines significantly affected store profitability. Operating costs remained largely fixed across the retail network. Lease agreements continued requiring consistent monthly payments. Staffing levels remained necessary to operate stores. Utility costs and maintenance expenses persisted. As revenue weakened, margins compressed across many locations. Financial reporting reflected increasing operational pressure. Store-level performance metrics showed uneven results. Some stores continued performing adequately. Others began struggling to maintain profitability. Corporate leadership monitored declining rental frequency closely. Late fee income also began decreasing alongside rental volume. Consumers migrating to subscription services avoided penalty charges entirely. Digital platforms reshaped expectations around access and pricing. Unlimited viewing models contrasted with individual rental transactions. Blockbuster attempted several pricing adjustments. Some initiatives reduced or eliminated late fees. These changes aimed to improve customer perception. However, removing penalties also reduced a significant revenue stream. Financial trade-offs complicated strategic adjustments. Store networks still required high operating revenue. Digital competitors operated with lower physical overhead. Streaming services scaled without retail leases. Operational leverage increasingly favored digital platforms. Blockbuster's cost structure remained tied to its store footprint. Retail infrastructure became harder to support financially. Store closures began appearing in underperforming markets. Each closure reduced geographic coverage. Lease termination costs limited how quickly locations could close. Declining revenue accelerated pressure across the network. Debt obligations remained present during this decline. Interest payments continued regardless of store performance. Capital for transformation remained constrained. Executives attempted to stabilize cash flow through restructuring. However, the pace of decline accelerated. Customer behavior had shifted toward convenience and on-demand access. Retail visits became optional rather than habitual. Digital competitors expanded their content libraries. Streaming adoption continued rising year by year. Blockbuster's traditional revenue base eroded steadily. Structural takeaway: revenue decline accelerates when legacy cost structures remain fixed while consumer behavior shifts toward more efficient alternatives. By 2010, Blockbuster's financial pressures had reached a critical level. Revenue decline combined with fixed obligations created persistent cash flow strain. Debt payments remained due regardless of store performance. Retail operations alone could no longer sustain the financial structure. Management explored restructuring options during this period. Negotiations with creditors attempted to stabilize the company's position. Operational restructuring plans included closing underperforming locations. However, lease agreements limited how quickly stores could be shut down. The company continued operating thousands of locations globally. Retail overhead remained a significant operational burden. Creditors monitored liquidity conditions closely. Access to additional financing became increasingly limited. Financial analysts began questioning the company's long-term viability. Digital competitors continued expanding their subscriber bases. Streaming adoption increased across multiple markets. The contrast between digital convenience and retail friction became more visible. Blockbuster attempted to reposition certain services online. However, the scale of transformation required significant capital. Existing debt obligations reduced financial flexibility. Operating cash flow continued weakening throughout the year. Corporate leadership ultimately pursued bankruptcy protection. In September 2010, Blockbuster filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The filing allowed the company to reorganize its obligations. Bankruptcy proceedings aimed to restructure debt and preserve operations. Creditors sought to recover value from the remaining business assets. Court-supervised restructuring evaluated the future of the retail network. Some stores continued operating during the bankruptcy process. Others were marked for potential closure or consolidation. The brand still maintained recognition among consumers. However, the economic structure of the business had deteriorated. Digital competitors had already secured strong market positions. Streaming platforms continued expanding their technology and content libraries. Consumer behavior increasingly favored digital access. Blockbuster's legacy infrastructure could not adapt quickly enough. Retail dominance had transformed into structural rigidity. The bankruptcy filing formalized the collapse of the legacy model. Financial restructuring attempted to preserve remaining enterprise value. Stakeholders evaluated possible asset sales during the process. Corporate leadership focused on stabilizing operations temporarily. However, the underlying market transition remained irreversible. Digital distribution had become the dominant trajectory for media delivery. Retail video rental had entered structural decline. Blockbuster's bankruptcy represented the culmination of accumulated pressures. The company's strategic inertia met technological transformation. Structural takeaway: bankruptcy often reflects long-term structural pressures rather than a single operational failure. Following the bankruptcy filing, Blockbuster entered a period of asset evaluation and restructuring. Court-supervised proceedings assessed the remaining value of the company. Creditors analyzed the viability of continuing operations. The retail network remained extensive but financially strained. Many locations were already underperforming. Store closures accelerated as part of restructuring efforts. Lease agreements were renegotiated where possible. However, many contracts still required settlement. Retail infrastructure continued shrinking during this process. Attention shifted toward identifying potential buyers. Investors examined the value of Blockbuster's brand recognition. The company still maintained a widely recognized entertainment brand. However, the operating model required transformation. Potential acquirers focused on the company's digital potential. In 2011, Dish Network acquired Blockbuster through bankruptcy proceedings. The acquisition transferred control of remaining assets. Dish evaluated how the brand might support digital distribution. Retail stores were no longer central to the strategy. Most remaining locations were gradually closed. Only a small number of franchise stores continued operating temporarily. The retail era of Blockbuster effectively ended. Corporate focus shifted toward digital experimentation. Dish integrated Blockbuster into its broader media strategy. Streaming services were already expanding rapidly at that time. Market competition remained intense in the digital sector. Blockbuster's brand alone could not reverse the industry transition. The retail infrastructure had already dissolved. Customer behavior had moved toward subscription streaming models. Digital platforms dominated new entertainment distribution. Data-driven recommendation systems guided viewing choices. Content licensing became central to platform competition. Streaming libraries expanded continuously. Consumers expected immediate on-demand access. Physical media distribution became increasingly rare in most markets. The Blockbuster name remained a recognizable historical reference. However, the underlying business model had collapsed. Corporate restructuring preserved limited brand value. Asset transfers concluded the bankruptcy process. Financial obligations were partially resolved through reorganization. Remaining operations were absorbed into the acquiring company. The retail footprint that once defined the brand disappeared. The collapse illustrated how structural commitments shape outcomes. A dominant market position could not prevent systemic transition. Strategic timing proved critical in responding to technological change. Structural takeaway: asset sales may preserve brand value, but they rarely restore a collapsed business model. Blockbuster's collapse illustrates how dominant companies can misread structural change. The company once controlled the largest video rental network in the world. Its physical retail presence shaped how consumers accessed home entertainment. At peak scale, the company operated more than 9,000 stores globally. Retail infrastructure provided visibility and convenience for customers. However, this infrastructure also created long-term structural commitments. Lease contracts and store operations required constant revenue. Debt obligations reinforced dependence on existing business models. These financial structures shaped how executives evaluated strategic decisions. Short-term stability often took priority over long-term transformation. Alternative distribution technologies emerged gradually. Early signals appeared through mail-based subscription services. Later, broadband expansion enabled streaming platforms. Each technological step reduced reliance on physical retail. Consumers increasingly preferred convenience and on-demand access. Digital services removed travel, queues, and return deadlines. Subscription pricing simplified the viewing experience. Recommendation algorithms improved content discovery. As adoption increased, digital platforms gained momentum. Blockbuster recognized these technological developments. However, organizational structure slowed decisive response. Retail operations remained the center of strategic planning. Large store networks were expensive to unwind quickly. Financial commitments limited the company's flexibility. Debt obligations constrained investment capacity. Innovation required capital that was already allocated. Competitors built platforms designed for digital distribution. Their cost structures differed fundamentally from retail networks. Streaming companies scaled through software and infrastructure. Blockbuster remained tied to physical locations and leases. Strategic delay compounded structural constraints. By the time transformation accelerated, competitors were established. Market leadership shifted toward digital platforms. The video rental store became economically obsolete. Retail infrastructure could not compete with instantaneous streaming. Blockbuster's brand recognition could not offset structural disadvantage. The collapse, therefore, reflects deeper organizational dynamics. Corporate systems reward stability when operations appear successful. These systems can resist disruptive change. When technology reshapes distribution models, legacy structures become liabilities. Strategic delay allows new entrants to define emerging markets. Blockbuster's experience demonstrates how structural commitments influence outcomes. The company did not lack awareness of digital change. It lacked the structural flexibility to respond quickly. Corporate collapse occurs when legacy structures meet technological stress. Structural takeaway: strategic delay becomes structural risk when capital is locked into legacy models, and corporate collapse occurs when structure meets stress.